Oh, hi there. Good morning. Welcome to this Buried in Treasures learning community for 2022. Again, this is a learning community that is meets monthly, generally on the fourth Tuesday of each month for all of 2022, where each month we tackle one, maybe two chapters from the self-help book Buried in Treasures, specifically the second edition from 2013. Today, we are going to be talking about chapter 6, how did this happen? We're going to go quite a bit into some of the background around cognitive functioning, cognitive impairment, the connection, that cognitive triangle of feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, and then specifically think about how that can be applied to certain behavioral patterns and trying to interrupt and rewrite those patterns. The book kind of goes back and forth between some of these more contextual chapters like this and more practical skill-based strategy chapters, which is what we had with Meet the Good Guys, Meet the Bad Guys over the past 2 months. So it's kind of that back and forth tension, which is, I think, good. So this is going to be a little bit more context, but there will be some definite tools to try. As always, my name is Shelley Bookbinder, and I work at the Rutgers School of Health Professions, and I've been contracted by the Healthcare Authority of Washington State to provide these trainings. My background is as a social worker, and at Rutgers, I work doing training and technical assistance for supportive housing providers. As I've shared in the past, I have a lived familial history with excessive clutter, with hoarding behaviors, and I have a research interest in waste and waste systems. I'm joined here by my colleague, Earl Leach, who's going to be in the chat helping out. Thank you so much for being here, Earl. So, as always, this is the Washington State Healthcare Authority information. This is meant to be interactive. It has been a relatively big group, and so we'll do our best to be interactive with the chat, using raise hand as there's time. So please, please, please participate, and the slides and recording will be sent out by the Healthcare Authority of Washington State. And as many of you noticed, I share them at the beginning of each session. So if you miss them that way, you'll get them again. Some very brief housekeeping. In terms of participation, please have the chat open. Also, if you'd like to share by raising your hand, I have everybody muted coming in to keep down on background noise, but that is absolutely a way that you can participate if you want to raise your hand. Although if your image is shown, that'll be captured in the recording. I also, as always, have a number of polls that I'll ask you to participate in, and anything shared in the chat, the links to the presentation, links to resources, you can save those at the end of the presentation by in your chat bar, going to next to the smiley face, the 3 dots to the right, save chat. And that needs to be done at the point when you want all the chat. So generally do that at the end. Oh my goodness. Debbie Lynn is calling in from Hawaii. Thank you so much for coming from so far and for calling in. And yes, absolutely, absolutely jealous. So hopefully the weather is beautiful and you're enjoying the time there. So in terms of audio, Debbie Lynn mentioned she's calling in. If at any point you're having difficulty hearing, speaking, anything like that, please use the call information that's here on the chat. My colleague Earl is also going to put that into the, thank you so much, into the chat there. So there's the call-in information, again, if you're having any difficulty hearing, and also today's presentation. Everybody's coming in muted, but if you unmute yourself, please remember to remute yourself. We're just trying to keep down on background noise and for the quality of the recording. The video, please feel free to have your video on or off. You can turn it on or off as you're comfortable. It's nice to see people. If your video is on, make sure your appearance and background is appropriate, and appropriate, that's a complicated word, just in terms of kind of work appropriate, not kind of home appropriate in terms of things that might be revealing and make other people feel uncomfortable. Although I even feel like saying work appropriate is a complicated and very loaded thing. Subtitling is available on the Zoom bar if anybody's interested. So on the Zoom bar, you'd go to the 3 dots and show subtitles. And the video that's available from Zoom will also have closed captioning in efforts around accessibility. So somebody just emailed me about this. So this is the schedule in terms of the days we're meeting and the meetings for all of the year. So if you want to keep up in terms of reading, it's always the fourth slide. So you have that in the presentations. So again, we're meeting Tuesdays monthly from 9:30 to 11. It's generally on the fourth Thursday. However, I didn't want to write that because in August, due to vacation schedule, it's going to be on the not third Thursday, that's a different thing, the third Tuesday. So this is the schedule with all the dates, and you'll see here the topic has a chapter next to it. So if you want to follow along, if you have the book, wonderful to follow along. It's absolutely not a requirement, but if you'd like to, you have the chapter, topic, and the date here. And again, it's always that fourth slide. So now we're going to do a quick review from the April session. And thank you for everybody for writing in the chat where you're from. It's wonderful to see some people who have been here before and to have that wonderful sense of community. So thank you for that. So from the April meeting, we talked about the good guys. So in March, we talked about meet the bad guys. Those are some challenges, some challenging patterns. April was the good guys, and those were specific strategies and positive habits to address hoarding behaviors. There were 6 of them that were laid out. I'm not going to talk about all of them again, but keeping your eye on the prize, working from the downward arrow from certain thoughts, certain feelings down to kind of the root of what that is, what those feelings, what those thoughts are, thinking it through. Those are questions to ask yourself when certain behaviors, when certain, having difficulty around discarding, having difficulty with excessive acquiring, some questions to ask oneself or to have someone else ask you. Then there was also the practice muscle, thinking about building up tolerance and time in one's schedule to practice some of these behaviors of organizing, decision-making, sorting. And providers can be part of the team. And the way Buried in Treasures works, again, it's a self-help book, but there are these kind of moments for coaching and for support. And there were some recommended things to do to not take over decision-making, to think about how to offer support in terms of trips that are positive, that don't involve acquiring, thinking about other kind of behaviors, thinking about ways to cheerlead and be positive, but again, not to take over decision-making and tell people exactly what to do. So there were some great coaching suggestions that were covered as well, in addition to some of the challenges. So the April presentation and recording are available linked here in today's presentation, so you can access those at any time. Earl is also going to put that into the chat. So if you save the chat or want to take a look at them now, they're going to be there. As always, there's something to do at the end of each session, and the learning application that we had was to try or share thinking it through questions. So these were a set of questions that came from Buried in Treasures. And these questions were, again, designed for people, not necessarily helping people, but for people to ask themselves. And what I asked you to do was to try or share something those thinking it through questions. So to try in terms of providing services, maybe to try in terms of asking yourself, or to share with colleagues or other people that it might be useful. And so I want you to think about, for those of you who did try or share, I have a poll. And as always, I ask people, were you able to attend the April meeting, the meeting before? Yes or no? Because it would be hard to do this if you didn't attend the meeting because you wouldn't know what to do. So if you attended, did you ask any thinking it through questions? I put some questions there and it's select all. So some of the questions, how many of these do you have? How many would be enough? Do you have a specific plan to use this item? Have you used it in the past year? Is it of good quality? Do I really need it? That's a self question, even though this could be turned, do you really need it? Any other kind of thinking it through questions, not yet, or is it not applicable because you weren't in the meeting? And then if you did ask some of those questions, did you find them generally helpful, generally unhelpful? So just getting a sense of that. And I'll give folks about a minute to reflect. And if anybody would like to share any experiences you had with the thinking it through questions, again, asking it to yourself, maybe sharing it with a colleague, sharing it with somebody you know. So if anybody wants to share any of those experiences, and I'll let the poll run as well. And I think that's why the chapter had some stuff on coaching, because while the questions are designed for people to ask themselves, there is absolutely a role for a way to be non-judgmental, as was really highlighted in the book and is generally highlighted in terms of services, not just with hoarding behaviors or hoarding disorder, but thinking about how these questions can be used in a way that feels exploratory as opposed to judgmental. Really important to think about. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll in about 10 seconds if anyone else would like to vote. And we'll see what happened. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll now. And we had, great, so we have kind of a 60-40 breakdown in terms of people who responded, who came to the last session, who didn't. If you attended what thinking it through questions, so popularly asked, have you used it in the past year? Do you have a specific plan to use this item in a reasonable time frame? And how many of these do I have or do you have? And how many would be enough? But also, do I really need it? Do you really need it? Is this of good quality? And some people haven't gotten a chance yet, or it's not applicable. And for those who asked, most people said they were generally helpful. So that's absolutely great to know. So I see a couple people shared in the chat. Cherie, I use this as of good quality. I have a resident who just got a pretty big increase in income. And so we're speaking about quality of what she purchases. Yeah, and that question around like, is this durable? Will this be useful? Is this kind of more single use? And then you'll have something that maybe isn't easily repairable. There's actually something I was just reading this past week about pushing around repair and especially technology in repair, that there's so much kind of cheap technology, cheap watches, movement watches, and they're very difficult to have repaired. And so that question about like, is this something that I can keep? And if you have a broken version, something I've seen in my own family is having 6 smartwatches, right? Because the wristband breaks, this doesn't work. And then kind of the piling up, oh, I could get this repaired, but I don't. And that kind of the piling up of kind of what I would think of as e-waste, but people feeling really conflicted about that because who wants to throw things away that aren't that old? So that's a great thing to think about in terms of quality. Thank you for sharing that, Cherie. I hope that was helpful. Sarah Lynn, while breathing lately from the loss of my mom, I realized shopping is a good distraction, not addiction, mostly browsing and buying 1 to 2 items. I found 1 to 2 beautiful coffee cups. When I got home, I went through my current coffee cups and decided to donate 3 old ones. And we talked a little bit about that kind of in and out. And like you're saying, just because you're acquiring things doesn't mean it's unhealthy, and finding things that you really appreciate, and kind of having those questions there to think about that, right? That is something that you wanted and you could make the decision to have something out. So it is also good that thinking it through doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to get something. And I think that's important to think about, that people still have choices about what they're getting. So Melanie, one client remarked, of course, I can think of something to do with it. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. So this is also, this I think goes back to the example of like the 6 smartwatches, which I just went through this weekend. And I was like, I don't know, they kind of work, kind of don't work. There's not really a use for them. Yeah, this thing of like, maybe I could fix this and maybe I could give it to somebody, or maybe it could serve some other purpose, right? And that's a complicated thing. If somebody feels that there's a use for it, kind of taking it away or not getting it isn't really, and we'll talk about this more in terms of excessive acquiring. A little bit, it's in 2 chapters. There's a chapter on acquiring, which I think will be helpful to think about this. It's chapter 8. But yeah, that question of I can think of something to do with it is really challenging. And I think there are some more kind of, that kind of moves to rules, away from questions to rules, coming up with rules that the person can live with away from specific items, but generally that the person wants, because then it doesn't get into, could I use this? It's like, again, rules about 1 in, 1 out, thinking about, as opposed to just like, of course, you can think about using lots of things, but what are ways in which you want to live, ways in which you want to spend, ways you want to bring things in. So that's going to be in 2 months in terms of chapter 8, excessive acquiring. So I think that'll be helpful, not just questions, but rules that the person can come up with for themselves. And there's a guideline in there to kind of start with those, and then people can amend it. Laurel, I got a shoe rack that fit a specific number of pairs. I got rid of too many tennis shoes. Yeah, and people have mentioned this, that kind of a lot going out and then kind of like overcorrecting in a way. So Katie, helping my parents downsize from 12-acre hobby farm to a smaller house. My dad's favorite phrase, just because I haven't used in 20 years doesn't mean I need to get rid of it, right? And that sentimental attachment, that sense of remembering, cueing with memory, exactly, those questions, some people's, not everybody has the same type of attachment, but for some certain sentimental attachments, that question of use doesn't really come into it, which is an absolutely great point, which is why the experimenting, that was not the only type of good. That isn't for everything. For people with more sentimental attachments, use and thinking it through is not sufficient. So that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up, Patty. Cherie, it was more focused on going out and finding things behind stores or in garbage, feeling as if she needed to hold on to it because she doesn't have money to purchase what she needs or wants. And now she can purchase what she needs and wants. Thank you for clarifying that. And I do think getting things that aren't quite right, whether it's like you said, behind stores, people have kind of gotten rid of, put on the curb, behind dumpsters. Yeah, the size might not be right, the fit might not be right, the use might not be right. And you're right, more fitting needs as opposed to picking up. And I do this sometimes. I'll get things incredibly cheaply or kind of put out and it's never the right thing. And so I end up getting more and more. And that's another kind of way to acquire a bunch of stuff. So thank you for adding more specificity. So I'm going to read just these last two. People can continue to share, but then we're going to move on to new content. So Angela, I'm trying to think about how much money and effort I'm spending to refurbish something instead of getting a new quality one, looking at an old trike. Yeah, and that question about repair, donation, how much time and effort to keep into things. I mean, I personally am trying to do more in terms of repair and reuse and getting kind of used stuff just in kind of my own space right now. But I think that question about time and energy, is it actually likely to be fixed? Is it likely to be usable? Is it likely to meet needs? Or is it just kind of sitting there because it's hard to think about getting rid of it? That's an excellent thing to think about. So Michaela, I have a client whose delusions led her to be unable to reduce items. What if the store is all closed down? Yeah, and those kind of thoughts about like usefulness and like, I need this because I don't know what's going to happen, and mixing with other mental health issues, incredibly challenging because there are some shortages right now in terms of supply chains. And the question of like, well, not everything has a shortage right now and not everything needs to kind of be kept, but there are these kind of mixing with mental health concerns and actual supply chain things right now. People can apps that can kind of feed into people's concern about not enough needing to keep. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, okay, yeah, Linda, there was a request for me to slow my speech, so thank you. I will absolutely make an attempt to do that. And as always, if there's something I say that's a little too fast, I do have a tendency, I lived in New York for 15 years, tendency of quick speech, even though I am from New England, which I guess people from New England, they say also speak quickly. I'm just predisposed to speak quickly. So thank you for the reminder of to slow down a little bit and in a very kind way. Okay, so thank you for giving those a try. Again, that was just one of 6 strategies. And if testing out ideas, like the example that was given, Michaela's example, worrying that if things close down, that might be more of a testing it out. Right, to actually test out, I think this might happen. Was that actually what happened? So that was a different good guy strategy, which if somebody is really anxious about something, that actually not just questioning, but testing might be a kind of stronger way to do that, which is why I think it's good that there are multiple strategies. And they do that in a way so that you start more with the thinking and then go more to the testing and the actual trying out things and working on skills. So I think that's, if you look through the 6 good guys, it does kind of move from the head to actually doing things. So what we're going to do today is, again, cover chapter 6, which is about the context of how we get there in terms of excessive clutter and in terms of hoarding behaviors. And by the end of this, you should be able to identify hoarding-related cognitive impairments, so different ways in which cognition is impacted. Also being able to identify hoarding behavior reinforcement patterns. And as I mentioned, there's a cognitive triangle for people familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, of thoughts, feelings, and actions. And so being able to make that connection and how that can reinforce certain behaviors, and to be able to identify and evaluate a tool to test out discarding. So we're going to end with thinking about patterns and trying to interrupt those with a tool to challenge some of that. So this was a quote from chapter 6 from Buried in Treasures. I don't like the exact phrasing of it. Some of the stuff in Buried in Treasures, the language used isn't, I think, the least stigmatizing, but I do think this question of hoarding is not a house problem, it's a person, it's also a person problem. And I think this moving away from just the focus on stuff to the focus on people and the processes, that's why at this point, like stepping back a little bit from focusing on stuff, focusing on discarding, to focusing on the internal processes going on with somebody. So I do think this is a good point kind of in the book to take a step back to the person. And so as we talked about in January session, right, hoarding disorder is a mental health condition that's been in the DSM-5, the ICD-10. So it is a recognized mental health condition, but just thinking about behaviors as mental health issues, it doesn't necessarily have to be the level of a disorder. And it is absolutely in the context of family, in terms of community, and we talked about trauma, adverse experiences. So it's not just mental health, but those things kind of impact mental health. And right, people are not entirely in control of their behaviors. Now that's a larger question, is anybody entirely in control of their behaviors, which I think we should think about because there's so many contextual factors. But right, people are not entirely in control of their behaviors. There are a lot of incredibly strong urges, which over the next few chapters, we'll talk about how to be able to tolerate those urges a little bit better, but people have incredibly strong urges. And this is the discussion that's been going on around addiction and behavioral addiction, right? That people have such incredible urges that it's incredibly difficult to kind of work against that. I'm not saying hoarding disorder, hoarding behaviors are addictive, but there are these incredibly strong urges, and this kind of mixes with that discussion of behavioral addictions. Right? So it's beyond someone's kind of bad personality. And I think in terms of family relations and in the literature around family relations, it can be very much people are lazy, people are stubborn, which is how it can look like to family members, maybe to staff. But what's going on? What are the cognitive processes that are making it challenging for people to do something else, or that are coping mechanisms? We'll talk quite a bit around avoidance in chapter 8. I was just looking at chapter 8 today, that's why I'm thinking about it. So thinking about the way in which there's a purpose to this. Okay, thanks for letting me know, Kimberly. Sometimes I refer to people in the chat just because it's easier when I'm presenting than writing. But to people who write things directly to me in the chat, that's absolutely fine. So beyond just thinking about kind of people's laziness, stubbornness, thinking about kind of the context of that in terms of what kind of urges, what type of behavioral context there is. And change means restructuring thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. I did that in the wrong order in my mind. So that's what we're going to talk about kind of for the rest of the book, is restructuring some of those things, thinking about building skills in those areas. But again, today we are going to really get into what those behaviors, some of those challenges are, starting with hoarding behaviors in the brain. And so I have a quick question through a poll. Do you agree that people with hoarding behaviors are not entirely in control of their behaviors? There's no right or wrong answer. I just wanted to get a read. It's completely anonymous. So often, sometimes, rarely. Because I know that this is a very challenging issue, specifically if you're working with people, a lot of people not seeing a lot of progress. This question of how much do people have control over whether they change or their behaviors is quite complicated, right? And thinking about what you see versus, what you don't see in terms of some of the challenges people have, some of the, again, trauma, adverse experiences, violence people have experienced, and how, just thinking about some of the experiences people have, the ability of people to kind of get by day to day, like some of the coping things that people do is very difficult to kind of work with people around, but there's reasons that they do it. It's how people sometimes manage to function. So I'm going to end the poll in about 5 seconds if anyone else would like to vote. Okay. Okay, so we have kind of a split. Most people are saying often or sometimes, a couple people are saying that they're rarely not in control. So, but kind of a consensus of people who responded that people are often or sometimes not in control. So that's an important thing to be thinking about as we go through and start with the impacts of hoarding disorder, hoarding behaviors. Again, some of the people, this is in reference to people with hoarding disorder in the book, but is generally more applicable to people with hoarding behaviors, excessive clutter, or who haven't been diagnosed with hoarding disorder. So from brain scans of the frontal and temporal lobes of people with hoarding disorder, and again, this comes from the Buried in Treasure book. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today is actually from Buried in Treasure. It's not like that every month, but today a lot of it's going to be from Buried in Treasures. There's overactive brain functions when people are interacting with their stuff they own, stuff they want to own. And so everything is important, right? So this hyper level of importance, which can lead to hyper focus around getting something, buying something, or it can be a sense of complete overwhelm. If everything is important, it's really hard to make decisions. And then also what's found is underactive, and this is compared to kind of the general population, underactive brain functions with things that are unrelated, not their stuff, right? People not seeing things that aren't theirs as being relevant, which is why this also can lead to people kind of not putting attention on things that they don't see as relevant, don't see as their possessions. And this kind of under and over is something we'll come back to in terms of attention, in terms of other things today, kind of hyper-focused attention, and then kind of not putting enough attention. So that kind of unbalanced look. Yeah, so Tracy, you're asking to give an example. Interestingly, I was just asking that folks could give an example. So I would say in terms of overactive brain functions and kind of the brain lighting up, that would be hyper concentrated attention, right? A hyper focus on items. And so that could be, and I think in the context of this chapter, that could be on finding a deal, getting this like hyper kind of like, you think about having blinders on, that kind of hyper attention, your brain is firing on all cylinders, like this like hyper focus. And so that would be the overactive attention, but it could also be, if there's too much stuff going on, that could be divided in a lot of ways and look like people being kind of very disorganized and kind of moving from thing to thing and seeming incredibly distracted. I would say either of those could be the impact of this incredible overactive brain function. Can anyone think of an example of this or where this might be true? In dollars. Yeah, okay, so that's a great, that kind of like everything is incredibly exciting, especially things with sounds, with what am I thinking? The senses, so bright colors, just everything is kind of like amazing and new and dewy and exciting. Yes, so that can be this kind of overstimulation. The brain is kind of firing on all cylinders. Can a person have overactive and underactive brain function at the same time? That's an interesting question. I think it depends on what's going on. Yeah, I mean, you could have that there's kind of relevant information going on. So if you think about, yeah, that could definitely be at the same time. So if you have, for example, somebody looking for something, shopping for something, but there's something else really important going on, maybe somebody calling their name, maybe there's a fire drill, maybe there's something else, but that's not seen as relevant. So that can devalue the other information around health and safety, or other things going on with a focus on getting something, carrying something, acquiring something. Yeah, so those two can absolutely, and that can be dangerous for people. They can also, for example, ignore things around finances, health, because there's such a focus on things that safety and other things can be devalued. Yeah. That's a great point. So D Moore, your down son can have both going on. Yeah. And so I think that this kind of balance, it does make it really challenging because that hyper focus can really split attention, but then also make it challenging to take care of other things that are not possession related. Yeah, Melody, that's a great. So that's a great example. Thank you for sharing. The brain is overactive when thinking about getting rid of something. Yeah, so this kind of what's going to happen. This came up a little bit earlier in someone's example, this idea of I'm not going to have enough. So this kind of cycling, like very quick, kind of thinking about the eventualities and the concern about getting rid of stuff, but then unactive in terms of safety issues. Yeah, so kind of thinking about health and safety, maybe thinking about requirements for the building, not so concerning. But then the actual, what if I got rid of this, becomes very all-encompassing and really a point of focus, and it becomes very difficult, especially if there's all these kind of thoughts about stuff, about responsibility, about whatever kind of attachment that you have to those things. So that's a really great example of the kind of under and over. Thank you for that. So in this context of the impact of hoarding disorder, hoarding behaviors, on the brain, there's been found in research to be cognitive functions that are impaired in relationship to these brain changes. And these kind of cognitive impairments can make sorting, discarding, non-acquiring challenging. As Melody just mentioned, in the experience of actually thinking about discarding things or having to get rid of things, those kind of functions can make it difficult to actually make a decision. And so the first, and I think the really highest order thing we're going to talk about in terms of impairment is problems with attention. And I think these problems with attention, kind of in the over and under of brain functions, right? Attention is about selecting what to pay attention to, what stimulus, what inputs you think are important and that you're going to put your focus on. And what's been found is that distractions for people with hoarding disorder are more frequent, intense, and compelling. And this is this question about kind of urges and how much control people have over their behavior. That, right, it's not that people have no control, but these urges are intense, frequent, and compelling. Right, so that's kind of, there's all these distractions, or as we talked about, there's hyper focus. And these things happen at different times. So these moments where like there's kind of that zooming in and blinders, or where there's so many distractions and it's very hard to focus on anything. And either that over or under, both of those times are difficult to do things. And so I think that kind of that attention of hyper attention or really finding incredible intense distractions are both really challenging. And these problems with attention have impacts in terms of categorization, right? Because you think about if somebody is hyper focused on belongings, they might become, right, focused on, we talked about this a little bit, tons of categories. Each item is individual and having too many categories, which makes it really confusing and hard to categorize. Or a lack of categories, right? If you're distracted, if it's hard to focus on things. So the hyper focus can lead to, right, a lot of small individual categories or just no categories at all, right? If there's maybe low kind of function or a high level of distraction, making categories at all can kind of seem like too much. Also, in terms of problems with attention, come problems with decision making, right? Because if you have these kind of very influx, high and low levels of attention, that can lead to really high indecisiveness with certain stuff. Now, if we're talking about, for example, acquiring, that hyper focus could be completely decisive, right? But when we're talking about actually making decisions that are not kind of feeding into people's urges and desires, then that can lead to high levels of indecisiveness in terms of making decisions about what to keep, what to get rid of, what to sort, those type of things. Problems with attention can really negatively impact that. There's also associated problems with memory, and these are for all types of tasks. So remembering what items one has, yes, but also about bills, the timing of bills, around chores, keeping schedules, things like that, real challenges around that. And often people report using physical reminders. So that can be a stick-it note, that can be an actual item. So having a lot of these reminders, and then those reminders get overwhelming and cluttered. And so that kind of contributes to things. And so I again have another poll, which is, what of these cognitive functions have you seen impacted by hoarding, hoarding disorder, hoarding behaviors, problems with attention, problems with categorization, decision-making, memory, some other cognitive functions? We talked a little bit about executive functioning, which is kind of a little bit above what we're talking about, or have you seen none of them impacted? And I have from Melanie in the chat, yeah, so overactive and acquiring and holding on to, and that hyper focus, and underactive minding, the whole home is piled in boxes of possessions, leaving only a mile pathway. Exactly. And so that becomes like the actual acquiring of things is kind of overactive brain, and underactive in terms of organizing, categorizing, doing those things that might require some degree of sorting, assessing, categorizing, making decisions about whether these items belong here, that type of thing. So thank you for that example, Melanie. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll in 5 seconds if anyone else would like to vote. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now. Okay, so decision making. Most of the people who responded said yes, they've seen problems with decision making, but then pretty evenly with attention, categorization, and memory. And some people said some other cognitive functions. I'd really be interested to know if you want to share in the chat other cognitive functions that are impacted. That would be great to see. So if people would like to put that in the chat, I'm going to continue to move on in the interest of time. But yeah, so these are absolutely things that are going to make it challenging to sort, to discard, to not acquire things. And again, that level of attention is really key in all of this. And that hyper focus, I think, doesn't so much get focused on. And those urges, again, we're going to talk about that more in 2 months. Yeah, so Melody, when your mother was in the throes of Alzheimer's, she would misplace things and then blame us on them for stealing them. Yeah, and that interaction, somebody mentioned also like active delusions. So in the case of Alzheimer's, that's like additional challenges in terms of memory kind of loaded onto maybe existing challenges. Yeah, Melody. So I'm unmuted. So, and that's absolutely important to think about, that it's not just necessarily one thing going on. There can be physical changes, other mental health things, and that can absolutely kind of increase issues around memory. So Sharon, thinking about the impacts on health and ignoring the cause and effect, lifting, seeking lost things, turning and rotating. And we're going to talk about this actually next month more in terms of the reinforcement and the cycle, whereby it's difficult to kind of interrupt because we're going to talk about this actually a little bit later today, Sharon, but I'm glad you brought up this kind of pattern and negative kind of feedback. So now in emotions, so we talked about the brain, cognitive functions, and how does this turn out in terms of emotions, thoughts, and behaviors? So what's been found, and we talked a little bit about, was general emotional discomfort. That people, right, part of the kind of background of this, not in entirety, but is adverse experiences, is violence, is different degrees of adverse experiences and trauma. And so a general kind of emotional discomfort. In the book, they say feeling rotten. So I put an icon of a rotten fish, but I don't think that's entirely fair. But I did need an icon there. So general feelings of emotional discomfort, right? And so thinking about in that general feeling of emotional discomfort, emotionally not feeling great, some of the behaviors, acquiring, holding on to things, kind of fill that void. And so thinking about positive feelings around acquiring, some people have brought that up, that hyper focus, joy, excitement, finding a treasure, some of those feelings. Sentimental attachment, this was brought up in response to the, are you going to use this? Well, it doesn't matter. I don't need to use it for it to be important. So connection to people, places, times. And again, not all of these are true of everyone. It's definitely situation dependent. But these are some of the examples of some of the positive feelings, the kind of things that people can get out of some of these behaviors. Feelings of identity, right? I am what I own. These items are important to my sense of who I am, maybe where I come from. And then the feelings of safety, security, and control. And the example in the book is this idea of a nest or a cocoon, that things are building a literal wall of safety. And you think about for people maybe who have been unhoused, who have had other kinds of instability in terms of living situation, building a nest of things that feels protective, especially if maybe things were taken, people didn't have enough things, and that as being protective. Sorry, I'm going to, I didn't turn off the annotate, which I should have done. Give me a moment. Sorry, that was a little confusing. Sometimes I forget in my account, it doesn't have annotation disabled. So sorry about that. And so I want you to think about what are some common emotions. Again, not everybody experiences these, but what are some common emotions that you've seen? And do you agree, first of all, with the idea that people with hoarding behaviors have some general emotional discomfort that you've seen? Again, that can be sad, fearful, irritable, but kind of a general level of emotional discomfort. Generally, yes, generally, no. And what emotions have you seen related to hoarding, not discarding, acquiring things, sentimental attachment, positive feelings, feelings of identity, feelings of safety, security, and control? So take about another 10 seconds. I want to make sure that we have time for everything. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now. Oh, wow. Okay, so 100% of people said yes, generally yes. And again, it's not always the same. So sometimes it can look more as depression, sometimes it can look as kind of volatility and irritability. Sometimes it can, again, the mention of somebody at the beginning who was very fearful about shortages, right? So it doesn't always look the same, but general kind of discomfort. And then in terms of different types of attachment, so feelings of safety, security, and control, the most people responded said that, and then sentimental attachment. And that really does kind of fit into narratives that it's not necessarily around use, but it is around, you know, having the items as a protection, having some type of attachment, feelings of identity. So, okay. Thank you for sharing. So these are kind of the rules in emotions, and from emotions, those can convert into thoughts, and kind of in your thoughts, this goes back to some of the bad guys we talked about from chapter 4, some of the things that those thought patterns that make it challenging. So we're not really going to go so much. This is kind of a review from session 4, but there are a lot of entrenched, inflexible thoughts. And I want you to think for a moment about inflexible, entrenched thoughts about possessions, around acquiring things, around kind of people's relationship to stuff, ideas that people have. Some people have shared a couple of things, but I'm going to ask you to share in a moment. And I want, as I go through these are just some examples from the book, to think about what is an inflexible, entrenched thought around stuff, around acquiring, around keeping, around not kind of getting rid of things that you've seen. Because that kind of element, that there's these strong kind of discomfort things, and there are certain very strongly held thoughts about the need to have certain things and to keep certain things and to acquire certain things. And I'd like, if people feel comfortable to share those, please do. And so from the book, right, we talked about this beliefs of usefulness, of not producing waste, of responsibility to items or to people. Somebody gave this to me, I have a responsibility to keep it. And some of these are helpful. They can be helpful, right? Right. And this could mean being frugal, being environmentally conscious. We've talked about how much waste is produced and disposability. And so there can be something to this idea of trying to reuse things, being creative about keeping things. But some of this just goes too far, right? A fear of ever being wasteful. And this is something right now I'm personally going through in terms of there's so much plastic that's been acquired in my family, and there is no way to recycle it. There's very little reuse for it. We're doing the best that we can, but a lot of things, like you can't do anything with DVDs nobody wants, and they're not recyclable. And that's, that's a really hard thing. And people make trees and art, but there's too many of them. And like that question about like that being held back by not wanting to waste is really hard. Overly creative thinking, right? We talked about this, creativity surpasses capacity. The idea I just gave you of the CD art, right? I have a bunch of shirts that I'm going to make into a quilt. I don't even know how to quilt, right? That kind of ideas of what I can do versus what I'm going to do. And perfectionism, this idea of having an idea of what you're going to do, what you'd like your possessions to be, and right, worrying around the wrong decision, avoiding any decision, and can really immobilize people. And so as I asked you for an inflexible thought that might be related to these or some of the other bad guys we talked about. So Megan, feeling overwhelmed since seeing everything. Mike, my things are collectible and worth a lot. Oof, this hits so close to home. I'm going through mountains of playing cards that are worth nothing, that were said to be worth, and Beanie Babies and all of these things that were going to be worth something. They weren't even kept very well, but I have family members telling me we have to keep them. It's, that kind of, this is a collection, and is worth something. That's a really hard thing. So thank you for sharing that. So Sharon, self equals things. Reject my things and you reject me. Yeah, that's really tough. That's really tough. So Susan continues acquiring new things, justifies that they're inexpensive or for a pet, right? I need this. It's just kind of a new thing, a new shirt, a new thing to kind of clean fur. Oh, so Mike, I just experienced the Disney room. I don't think I'm familiar with that. Is that, that you have so many Disney things, it feels like a Disney room. I do have a lot of Star Wars cards, which I don't think are very valuable, but I think Disney owns Star Wars, so maybe I have a bit of a Disney room, realizing that they own the Star Wars properties. So some of these inflexible thoughts, right? Because you have emotion, sentimental, people talked about sentimental attachment, joy from acquiring, and then you get these thoughts about usefulness, collectability around these items or me. So these thoughts become incredibly powerful. Yeah, so Diana, that's a really great point around poverty and lack. And this is something I've struggled with in terms of this idea of not being able to have things and now being able to have things with more financial capacity than I did for a long time. And I think that's really complicated because we've talked about advertising, the question of like, when does it actually cause impairment? Because I think these are impulses of marketing, of having us desire more. And the question of people wanting more than they had, that's just kind of an American thing, right? But the question of when does it get to the point where one can't use their space, that's the kind of definition we talked about in January and February, that this really becomes impairment, that none of this is so out of the ordinary, that this is kind of, these are American tendencies to kind of consume, to kind of accumulate, but the question of when it makes it so that you can't use your spaces, when it makes it so that it's a huge financial impact, that's where you start to see impairment. But I think, Dana, that's a great point, that there's a lot of reasons why. And I think like in terms of instability, that kind of sense of security and cocooning and safety with objects, that absolutely can go into that in terms of experiences of poverty, which may include housing instability, which may include possessions, maybe through evictions being taken away. So I think those can absolutely be ruptures that can be influential in terms of the development of some of these behaviors. Because that type of instability, I didn't have all of my things, I couldn't have the things that I needed, and that desire to have things can absolutely be connected to that. I'd want to say it's not always connected to that. Not everybody who experienced poverty is necessarily going to have these behaviors. So Michelle, I see this a lot from depression era persons, impoverished couples from childhood trauma. Yeah, people have absolutely, people like the studies of Holocaust survivors, very similar, having tons of food, having a lot of things, like this kind of sense of like in the wake of trauma, in the wake of lack, that this is a kind of response in a lot of ways to kind of, if you have these overwhelming feelings, overwhelming discomfort, fear, that this is a way to kind of balance that and to satiate some of those feelings. Because I do feel feelings are at the root of a lot of this. So thank you for both of those examples. Okay, so I'm gonna give people another moment and then we're gonna take a short break. Having to move quickly and losing everything during those times to getting somewhere stable can lead to not wanting to let go. Absolutely. And I do think like going back to earlier parts of the book and earlier months in thinking about instability, because people don't really know why people develop some of these behaviors, if not kind of mental health condition. It very much is kind of rooted in family systems and rooted in instability, trauma, adverse experiences. And so I do think whether that kind of trauma is system trauma of poverty, of homelessness, or whether it's specific, there's some research on, people who have been sexually assaulted, people who have been physically assaulted and developing behaviors. So I think there's many kind of roots to kind of come here, but a lot of it has to do with instability. A lot of it has to do with adverse experiences. So thank you for sharing those. We are at 10:22. And so I'm going to give everyone a 3-minute break until 10:25, and then we'll come back and continue. So I'm going to pause recording just so that people can. I'm going to resume recording. What came up during the break is that Debbie Lynn mentioned that some of the kind of uncomfortable emotional discomfort, that kind of base level emotional discomfort can include feelings of shame and guilt, in addition to feelings of irritability, fear. And so I just wanted to have that in the recording to make sure that that was clear. Okay, so in your behavior, so we've talked about feelings, we've talked about thoughts, and then how do these kind of impact behavior? And so, right, so if you have possessions that are evoking strong emotions, so whether that's kind of new possessions that you already have, which, right, the strong emotions could be joy, excitement, or they could be things around shame and guilt. And we'll talk about this in a moment, right, because you can have the possessions and finding them or getting them can be very exciting, but the kind of overwhelm of trying to think about categorizing or other things can bring up a lot of other very strong emotions, which are important to think about. And these emotions are motivators. And we're going to talk about this in 2 different ways. And so emotions can be relief from something unpleasant. So for example, that general emotional discomfort, the irritability, the fear, the shame, all those things, finding something new, getting something new, whether that's buying, whether that's, somebody mentioned finding things on the street, behind dumpsters, things like that. Those can be a relief from something unpleasant. It's something exciting, something to hyper focus on. So that is a motivator. Now, of course, there's also another kind of motivator, and that's payoff from something pleasant. And that's a very different way of thinking about it. That kind of, and we talked about this in terms of Meet the Bad Guys in March, that thinking about those short-term payoffs and the role of that hit of something new, finding something, buying something, the new thing, is absolutely something else. And these things can sometimes operate within the same person. Some people are much more about relief from the unpleasant and comfort. We talked about comfort, security, sentimental attachment, and having that relief from things that are stressful, right? Having stressful bills come in, having things happen, and having those items as a cocoon, as relief. Some people are much more about the payoff for the pleasant, or sometimes it balances depending on what's happening. But those are what they position as being 2 motivators, to increase or to decrease. And so think about, what have you seen as a motivator to hoard or to have kind of clutter? I didn't like the phrasing that I just had for that. But, and I have And this is, you can select all. So is it relief from unpleasant feelings, from fear, from irritability, from shame, from guilt, a relationship to possessions, a payoff for more unpleasant feelings, or is it something different that you're seeing, not kind of these motivators, or is it none of the above? And that could be just if you don't have experience with it, or if it's just those things don't really resonate with you. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll in about 10 seconds if anyone else would like to vote. I feel complicated. I want to give enough time, but also not slow things down too much. Pacing. Okay. Okay, so most people said relief from unpleasant feelings. So from that discomfort. So absolutely. And that's a lot of what we've talked about in terms of sentimental attachment, identity attachment, having that relief from unpleasant feelings. But then also about half of people who responded said payoff for more pleasant feelings. And so that kind of the hit of excitement, of focus on something new. Some people selected others. So if anyone wants to share that in the chat, something else that you feel like is motivating. Okay, so it's interesting. Relief from the unpleasant. So that's really the focus of where people were. So sharing, you had upcycle, look what I made out of something, saving the world. Yeah, and that's pleasant. That's a pleasant payoff, I would say. So kind of under the umbrella, right? That's kind of, I'm doing something good for the world. That's kind of something from like doing something with a possession, kind of a payoff is a way that I could kind of see it. But okay, so upcycling. So Christina, my client, wants to save things so he can sell them to get money for his drug use. Yeah, and so that's completely kind of a payoff for more pleasant, sell things. Well, that's interesting because that is getting rid of things, but specifically for something else. So that's complicated because it's like maybe somebody should be getting rid of things, but not to sell them for drug use. So that's a more complicated thing because it's kind of out of the pattern of hoarding and cluttering behaviors, but absolutely with an outcome with a behavior that's not safe for the individual. So that's definitely something else going on. So Melody, when my mom was growing up, they saved the thread from buttons and old clothing so they could reuse it. Absolutely. And there was just more, items were more expensive. There was much more reuse. Absolutely. And we've really gone to a period of hyper kind of disposability, and people absolutely saved more things. And so some people still have those kind of tendencies to save. I would say the same absolutely for my mom. She used to sew our clothing and all that stuff and save everything, scraps of fabric to reuse. So we have decades of fabric that's kind of moldy and other things that can't really be reused, but the idea that it could be reused at some point, absolutely. So I have Teresa, competition of items with another. So thinking about items in relationship to each other, to have a place to put things, not losing housing and teaching kids how to do what they need to become independent to leave the house. Okay, so thinking about independence and independent living skills. So Sarah Lynn, relief from unpleasant things relates me to shopping to distract myself from grieving. Yeah, from grieving loss for your mom. And that's really a relief from unpleasant. And so really think about, these are kind of big categories, but thinking about I'm not feeling well, so I'm shopping to not feel those feelings. That is very much more about kind of the unpleasant and trying to get relief from that. So Linda, absolutely. People acquire things to sell to make money, but end up holding on to them and not wanting to sell. Yeah, so this idea, I could sell this, but then the items become too important. Absolutely. Yeah, Melody, the idea that we're teaching, these behavioral stickers and stuff, people get things for certain behaviors. I think that like there's just such a focus on cheap disposable stuff. This is kind of me kind of stepping outside of things, that in general we focus too much. Oh, you have a run, let's get a shirt just for that run, let's get a, you know, and then it's like we're basically told like to throw everything away immediately, or we can't keep doing everything. And it's like I've started to not accept things when they're given to me. Like I went to something and they were like, have this pen and this, and I was like, no thank you, give it to someone else, you know, because it's like this constant flow of stuff. It's really challenging. The treasure chest at the dentist's office, right? And so this is like, I think this is where these behaviors come in contact with a society so focused on disposability and hyperconsumption. And I think I mentioned this at the beginning, that actually the bringing in of so much stuff is very kind of within the mainstream of society. It's the keeping and non-disposal, right? That's the thing that's outside of the norm, but the kind of hyper acquisition is actually not necessarily where people think there's a problem with hoarding behaviors. It's the keeping of the things that's kind of quote unquote dysfunctional. We can have a whole larger conversation about what's dysfunctional about producing so much disposable stuff that doesn't last very long, which is not kind of where we are in this discussion right now. But like that kind of tension of like so much coming in, which is expected to be dumped in garbage dumps and burned and all this other stuff, and recycled but not recycled. That's really complicated. So I'm glad that people are bringing it up, because it is absolutely a concern. So as I mentioned, the feelings, thoughts, behaviors do fit into this cognitive triangle. For those of you familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, that's again really the only behavioral treatment for that's actually like a clinical treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy for hoarding disorder. That's the gold standard for treatment for people with hoarding disorder. And it is kind of the framework for the self-help book. And it focuses a lot on feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And so thinking about starting with a feeling, and we've talked about this quite a bit, kind of emotional discomfort, right? So having bad news, having something difficult in terms of health around family, having maybe a bill come that's not payable right now, having a hard thing about housing or a job happening. So some type of emotional discomfort, maybe some type of shame for something that's happened. Then there's maybe a thought, I need something close to me, I need to get something. So a thought that kind of follows that. We talked about some of the inflexible thoughts. And then a behavior, which often contributes to this larger issue of cluttering. Now, this larger issue of cluttering and clutter kind of everywhere can, depending on the situation, lead to more emotional discomfort. People have mentioned health issues, have mentioned issues around safety, around family stuff. This is things that we've talked about. So that can be more discomfort, right? So the actual act of the kind of feeling, thought, behavior can lead to more discomfort. There's also times when the kind of cluttering can lead to positive feelings, right? Around that hyper focus on new items, this kind of like the kind of cocoon, sentimental attachment, kind of nesting with items, that can completely be positive feelings. Right? So this kind of circle can lead and contribute to feelings and can be driven by emotional discomfort or positive feelings. Because if someone has positive feelings around sentimental attachment, they might have a thought, I need to keep this, I need this, this represents me, which leads them to keep it, which leads to more feelings, which can be positive feelings or discomfort. And it's important that cluttering behavioral patterns are outcomes of both negative and positive feelings, right? So you have emotional discomfort, it leads you to clutter more. You have positive feelings around your attachment to items, that leads you to clutter more. And so both contribute to these patterns, both negative and positive, which is why it's kind of a reinforcement loop. And I think it's important to think about kind of both negative and positive patterns. And so now we're going to put it all together, which is what chapter 6 does. It puts everything together. And so they put out reasons to hoard or reasons to have hoarding behaviors. And they talk about, right, these cognitive impairments, the difficulty processing information. So issues with attention, memory, problem solving, emotional attachment, the sentimental attachment, senses of identity, or unhelpful beliefs about possessions, around needing the possession, about doing something creative with the possession, around reuse, somebody said upcycling, or reinforcement, just these reinforcement of thoughts, feelings, behaviors. So those are some of the reasons, and they lead to behavioral patterns where people avoid discarding, they save items, or to have excessive acquiring. So we're just putting everything together that we talked about, and this leads to, I made that way too big, and this can lead to clutter. And so think about, when could it be helpful for you or someone you work with to put this all together? Because the idea is that this is a behavioral intervention that people should become more aware of, which is why it's in a self-help book, of the reasons why they do things, right? Do I have issues with attention? Do I have issues with memory, with decision making? Are these some of the beliefs I have about myself, right? So the idea is that this is something that people can put together about themselves for self-knowledge. And so the question is, when would this be helpful, right? Not necessarily when someone's on an acquiring trip, right? That's not the kind of moment when they're hyper focused on something, or when they're feeling really not good and they feel like they need possessions to feel better. So think about, when might this be a good time? Now, if you're using this book to go through, which I'm hoping some people decide to do, to go through maybe on a group level or individually with people, right? That might be a time like in the progression of the book, but think about, when could this be deployed in a way that somebody is able to have reflection? Because right, when somebody is over kind of, we talked about this, brain stimulated or understimulated, both of those are not great times to think about this. So when is somebody in a position to actually take this information in? And so I'm going to give you a case example from the book to think about using this as an assessment tool for you to use. But then I also want you to just continue to think about, when would this be helpful information for somebody to kind of make these assessments about themselves. So Lusty, before someone gets a notice regarding losing their house. Yeah, that's going to drive up emotional distress so high. So you're going to try to pick a time, right, that emotional distress, emotional discomfort is not so high that it just, people go into kind of avoidance, people go into their possessions, into themselves. Absolutely. That's a really important point. So this is an example. It comes from page 76 of the second edition of Buried in Treasures. And what I want you to do is, I'm going to read this and I'd like you to think about, based on what we've talked about today, what are some of the reasons for Bill's hoarding behavior, right? What are some of the cognitive processes? What are some of the feelings? What are some of the beliefs, thoughts that are driving some of his behavior? Okay, I'm going to try to read this slowly. When Bill goes to a flea market and finds a bargain, he feels a sense of delight. He congratulates himself on finding his treasure and experiences what he calls the thrill of victory. It's easy to see how this good feeling can be a powerful motivator. He's likely to keep going back again and again in search of that feeling. Of course, the feeling never lasts that long. When Bill gets home with his new possession, he quickly realizes he has no place to put it. Frustrated and confused, he tosses it on top of a pile and he eventually forgets about it. You might ask, why don't Bill's feelings of frustration, confusion, and unhappiness with the clutter in his home serve as deterrents to acquiring more things? For the same reason that hangovers are not powerful deterrents for people with drinking problems. We all tend to be motivated most strongly by immediate rather than delayed consequences. This is a big part of the problem. Instead of being able to step back and appreciate the long-term consequences for our actions, we become slaves to the here and now. Okay, so I am going to, so this is Bill's situation. So I want you to think back to some of these reasons for hoarding and behavioral patterns. We talked about cognitive processes, we talked about thoughts, we talked about feelings. So what are some of the things that you think are driving Bill's behaviors, specifically this seeking of these treasures and the disorganized piles of clutter that are the outcome? So Melody, sounds like your twin brother. Yeah. So these patterns are not like, this is kind of, it's a specific case like drawn from somebody, but there is something about it which feels, you know, for a lot of people quite resonant, and some of the patterns and things. I think that's why they kind of pull Bill throughout. There's two cases they bring through the whole book. So Dawn, definitely reinforcement. Yes. So there's reinforcement that's happening. Absolutely. Excessive acquiring, Angela. Absolutely. So he's acquiring a lot, right? These experiences of treasures, emotional attachment to the beginning of my treasure, right? My possession, my treasure. So having some attachment to the item. What about those, that kind of balance between relief from unpleasant or experiencing more pleasant things? successful victory, right? And that goes to the idea that, right, this kind of short term, they talk about short term payoffs, this kind of experiencing of kind of a quick hit, wanting to feel kind of more of those good feelings, going and seeking treasures. Every time I find something, it's like a hit of something exciting. Absolutely. What about, yeah, it's like an addiction. Yeah, I talked a little bit about some of those kind of feelings of urges and those kind of urges that people talk about with behavioral addictions. Yeah, a high that doesn't last, right? And what are some of the cognitive processes you see here? Because we talked about issues around attention, memory, decision-making, and look at my memory, memory, decision-making, attention, and categorization. Don, interesting. So bringing some developmental kind of thought into it. Object permanence, it's not in front of you, it kind of doesn't exist anymore. So having the immediacy of the object, and then once it's not there, so some issues around kind of, you know, being able to hold the object kind of still in your thoughts, even when it's not right in front of you, you can't touch it. What about issues around memory? Right? He tosses it onto a pile and eventually forgets about it. Right? So this idea, right, you have something you've purchased, right? And think about that relationship to memory. Because I think there's a lot of things also around attention. And that's why I think attention is so much of it. Like, because he's really like that. And I think Melody brought this in terms of the high that doesn't last. It's so exciting to find, and there's so much attention, and then there's so little attention, almost no attention to it. The item almost disappears. And so this idea of kind of the shifting of attention seems really important. Yeah, memory, wanting to feel good, short term, then forgetting about it. Yeah. And so there's a lot going on here, but I definitely would say that this case is very much, the person is driven by the desire for pleasant feelings, for excitement, for that hit of excitement. Yeah, Debbie Lynn, I see that you're unmuted. Okay, I'm gonna mute you there, background noise. Okay. So community counseling, I see that you're unmuted. Was there something? Okay, just checking. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anyone. So this is important to think about. Again, not everybody's driven by, we had someone saying that it's like their twin brother. So really resonant. For other people, they're going to be much more driven by that relief from unpleasant. And so it's important to think about just how this is not everyone's experience. And there is another case in chapter 6 that's much more relief from unpleasant. And so it's important to think about being able to help people identify some of these patterns, that it's not just kind of one thing, and it's not that everybody has kind of the short-term payoff, but some of it is much more avoidance from these difficult feelings, trying to satiate difficult feelings, and right, this may change over time for people. Right, and so the behavioral pattern, and people brought this up, this is very much about acquiring that kind of positive feeling, thoughts around, I got a deal, this is exciting, this is something I'm going to use, that leads to the behavior that kind of cycles back through with each item, and the other items disappear into the pile. So changing patterns. So instead of just leaving us in this state of, we have this reinforcement triangle, we can't do anything, that's not where the chapter leaves us. It talks about changing patterns, right? And starting for changing patterns, it offers a resource to help people test discarding. Now, the idea is it's just a test. It's possible that the items will not necessarily stay discarded, right? And there is an acknowledgement for different levels of difficulty in terms of what's being done, which I think is helpful. And so the idea is that as a beginning for this, you select, or an individual selects 3 items to discard. Now, those items are categorized into difficulty to discard, from easy to moderately difficult to quite difficult. So this is very individual. So what do people think is the easiest item? What is the most difficult item when you think about getting rid of? So you have these 3 items and you have different difficulty. And then you think about how you're going to discard them, right? What does it mean? Is it a donation bin? Is it a waste bin? Is it a recycle bin? Like, what is actually going to happen to these items? And then The idea is to learn about the self and to learn about reasons to save, to acquire things, to keep things, to save things. And so testing out discarding with 3 items, Earl's going to share this in the chat. There's 3 forms from Buried in Treasures, which have for an easy item, a moderately difficult, and a very difficult item. The easy and the moderately difficult are basically the same. The quite difficult has extended questions, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so the forms, which I have up here, a screenshot from, you have, and this is from the easy, the moderate, and the quite difficult. What is the item? And then check the box next to any of the following that you experienced. Now, if you need to put more detail, there's extra space for more detail. So I had difficulty keeping my attention. It was hard to focus on the task. I had difficulty deciding what category to kind of put it into if I needed to keep it. I did a hard time making a decision. I thought of more and more reasons to keep it. I felt like I needed it to keep my memory. I was concerned of being wasteful or irresponsible with it. I was worried about making a mistake or being imperfect about how I categorized things or what I did. I felt sentimentally or emotionally attached. I felt like the item was part of who I am. I felt unsafe or out of control to part with the item. I felt too uncomfortable or difficult to part with the item or other. Then there's a scale from extremely easy to extremely difficult of how difficult it is to part with the item. And then did I actually part with the item? Acknowledging that some people make a plan to discard and don't actually discard, especially for the more difficult items. And so, hold on, I'm just gonna put these, sorry. I'm just gonna put these in the chat. So there are the items in the chat. You can take a look. These are all freely available online, but those are the 3 levels of difficulty in terms of the forms. As I mentioned, on the quite difficult forms, the idea is you start with the easy, you move to the moderately difficult, and then the more difficult, or the most difficult, quite difficult. The phrasing is interesting. And on the quite difficult form, so when you've done all 3, there's a space to reflect on reasons for saving. And so the reasons listed, and you can put additional reasons if there are, is about problems. And this is, again, these follow some of the questions. So the idea is to reflect and think about an easy item. Are those the reasons the same or different for a quite difficult item, right? Do I always have the same reasons, or do I actually have different relationships based on how attached I am or what I think about these items? Or is it kind of all around sustainability and waste? Is it much more around attachment? Does it depend on the item? So I have problems sustaining attention, I have problems with categorization, decision-making, overly creative thinking, poor confidence in memory, strong beliefs around usefulness, waste, responsibility, fears of mistakes or imperfection. That's funny because I messed that up right there in terms of not having it be a different checkbox. I have a strong emotional attachment to items. I use possessions to feel a sense of identity. I have strong beliefs about security and safety. I avoid discarding because it feels bad or something else. So it takes all the questions from the original forms and then says, okay, why do I save things? And so that's a moment of reflection. And so talking about behavioral patterns, this could be a really great way for somebody going through this process to then become more aware of their behavioral patterns. What's really going on here about why I'm saving? And that's a great point to, as the book goes on, to try to interrupt some of those patterns by becoming more aware of them. So I'm gonna kind of take a moment to take a look at those forms. And again, I'll go back here to this. Has anyone used this form before to test out discarding? Would be very interesting. Melody, I'm seeing a no. Christina, a no. The 2 people whose videos I can see, I'm seeing no. So I'm going to generalize that to being, I'm not going to generalize that. Okay, so Sarah Lynn, no. Great, so this is a tool. I'm going to ask actually for you to, okay, so Ashley, Kathia, yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of no's, which is good because I'm going to ask you to practice with this over the period before we meet again, because I think that this could be incredibly helpful in terms of, again, you can try it on yourself, you can try it with a colleague, you can work with somebody with it, but I think that this is, again, a moment for people to be reflective. And again, the goal is not necessarily to definitely discard the 3 items. It's not a failure if you don't discard the items, because the reasons why people keep them tells them a lot of information about themselves. So So I definitely think that this is not necessarily, this could be helpful and it could help somebody discard, but it might not. So I just want to kind of put that out there as a, kind of setting reasonable expectations. Okay, so from what I'm seeing, people who responded said don't have experience with this, which is, I'm glad that this is a new tool. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the learning application, but first, as always, I'm going to ask for some feedback. I had some in-training feedback around speed, but if there's anything in terms of the way resources were shared, if review happened, the way new information was presented, the way sharing or polls worked, anything like that, what worked, what would you change, all of that is incredibly helpful. So I'm just going to implore people to do that. So in terms of the learning application and next meeting, I'd also like to say that Ashley Croft from the Hoarding Task Force is going to make an announcement in a moment, right when I'm done with this. So please stay on for that wonderful announcement. Oh, great, Melody, thank you. When people remind me, it does help me to slow down. So I do appreciate the reminders. It's hard, but I appreciate them. So learning application for our June meeting, I want you to try or share the workshop, the worksheets to discard items, the easy, the moderately difficult, the quite difficult. If you can only try one of them, one item, that's fine. But if you can try the three, try to use the three, I think that would be good to see how it kind of works building up towards some self-knowledge, those last questions on the quite difficult. Think about, are there specific questions that were helpful? Was the scaling helpful? The 1 to 10 were specific, the checkbox questions helpful? Was that check-in, did I discard or not? What pieces of it were helpful? What questions were challenging for you or somebody else to respond to? So again, those are linked here in the presentation. And I'm going to share the presentation one more time. So they are in the chat, all those 3 items, but they're also here in the presentation. So you can download them here, but they're also in the chat box. I can post them again in the chat if anybody would like. As a note, our next meeting will be Tuesday, June 28th from 9:30 to 11 a.m. So that will be our next meeting. And for those of you who are reading along, we will be doing Chapter 7, Enhancing Motivation. So that will be the chapter we're covering. Again, it's also on slide 7. So yes, we are doing Chapter 7, Enhancing Motivation. So focusing quite a bit on motivation next time. And you are already registered. As you've noticed, I send out a reminder usually a week before and then the day of to get people to kind of like be ready for it. So I hope those kind of push notifications are helpful. I am going to turn things over. Great to hear, Melody. I'm going to turn things over to Ashley, who has an announcement about I'm glad they're helpful. Because I have difficulty remembering things sometimes, so it's helpful to kind of have things pushed a little bit sometimes. So I'm going to turn things over to Ashley for a moment, who's going to talk about an upcoming event in Washington State.
Hi, nice to see everybody, and thank you so much, Shelley, for everything that you are doing. So my name is Ashley Kraft. I work for Seattle Housing Authority, and I am also the co-chair for the Northwest Hoarding Coalition. And I wanted to make an announcement for our meeting for June 15th. We are going to be having presenters talking about Hoarding 101, an introduction to hoarding, how to create a safe, healthy space for your client who hoards. This training will be a brief introduction to hoarding on symptoms, its basic neurology of the brain, using a harm reduction framework. And the presenters are going to be by Doctors Schiltler, excuse me, I'm probably going to mispronounce the names, and Agler, provide practical tools and strategies to help your clients who hoard improve the health and safety conditions of their homes and avoid evictions. This presentation was actually presented at the Housing First Partners Conference in April, and my co-chair, Cricket Farr, participated, and she said it was a very good presentation and she was very impressed. So she asked them to participate in our meeting for next month. We meet the 3rd Wednesday of the month from 3 to 5 o'clock. The presentation next month will be about an hour long, and then we'll go into questions and also case consultations. I'm going to be putting the link to the to the meeting in the chat if I can get it to work. I'm having struggles for some reason. But if you are interested in getting emails from the Northwest Hoarding Coalition, if you could go ahead and put your email address in the chat, I will go ahead and collect those at the end, and we'll put you on the mailing list to make sure you get invited to our meeting. Again, that will be on Wednesday, June 15th from the presentation is from 3 to 4, meeting is from 3 to 5, and I hope everyone is able to attend.
Thank you so much, Ashley. So, and wonderful. People are putting their email addresses. Just as a reminder, Ashley, anybody else can save the chat by going into the chat to the 3 dots all the way to the right and save chat. And when you close out the meeting, you'll have everything. So, thank you so much. I don't want to run over time. Thank you so much for being here. I'm happy to stay on for questions, but have a wonderful month, and I hope to see you all in June.